All right, so let's look at lesson 6.5, conditions for rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. So what we're going to do is we're going to be given different diagrams, and you've got to determine what shape it is by the given properties, by what's been given. So if this picture is what's given to you, and you can determine the diagonals are perpendicular, and it's a parallelogram, then it's a rhombus. All four sides will be the same. Diagonals are going to bisect a pair of opposite angles. So if the diagonals of parallelogram are perpendicular, then the parallelogram is a rhombus. So now if the diagonals of a parallelogram bisect a pair of opposite angles, then you know that parallelogram is a rhombus. So a couple properties that both deal with diagonals, one being perpendicular, the other bisecting a pair of opposite angles. So once we know that it's a rhombus, then we know that all four sides are the same length. And for the rectangle, if the diagonals of a parallelogram are congruent, then the parallelogram is a rectangle. So all four sides here are different, but they're parallel to each other. Diagonals are congruent, so therefore it has to be a rectangle. So that means we have four right angles. And the last one, if it's got the properties of a parallelogram and it's also got a rectangle and a rhombus properties, then it's got to be a square. So if you've been given a diagram where it tells you the diagonals are congruent and they're perpendicular, then it has to be a square. So let's look at the first one, example 1, part A. Can you conclude the parallelogram is a rhombus, rectangle, or square? Well, if you look at this, if we look here, we see that we got angle here, congruent to the angle, this angles, all four angles are the same, which means that this has to be a rhombus because the diagonals bisect a pair of opposite angles. So when we say this, which one is it? It is a rhombus. And the reason is that diagonals, let's say a diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles. So, based on the information, we know that it is a rhombus, bisecting a pair of opposite angles. All right, let's take a look at the next one. So this one says, and I've changed the wording from your paper, a quadrilateral has an angle measure of 20, 160, 20, and 160. What is the most precise name you can give it? A parallelogram, a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square? So I'll give you a reason why at the end. So pause the video, figure it out, and come back and check your answer when you're done. All right, so this one is a quadrilateral, so it's worded a little different. So we know it's got four sides, but they give us 20, 160, 20, and 160, which means that because these two add up to 180 and these two add up to 180, consecutive angles are going to add up to 180, which means they're supplementary. So that is the property of a parallelogram. Now the most precise name means that if there's any more information we can get, we can determine whether it may be a rhombus, a rectangle, or a square. But based on this information right here, we know it's not a rectangle, we know it's not a square, so it could be a rhombus, but it doesn't tell us anything about the diagonals being perpendicular or that the diagonals bisect a pair of opposite angles. So the most precise definition we can give it is a parallelogram. All right, let's take a look at the last one. If the diagonals of a quadrilateral bisect each other, what is the most precise name you can give it? Parallelogram, a rhombus, a rectangle, or square? So the diagonals of a quadrilateral bisect each other. If you remember, those are the properties of a parallelogram, so the answer is also a parallelogram. So we can't determine anything else because there's not enough information to go any further. So the most we can determine is that this is a parallelogram. All right, so in example 2a through 2f, I want you to, through E, not F, I want you to look through these and determine whether they are, what the value of the variable is. So let's take a look at the first one together, and then you'll do parts B, C, D, and E. In the first one, it tells us that gives us here a rhombus. That's all we need to know. That means this diagonal bisects a pair of opposite angles, which means that these two angles are congruent. So that tells me how to set my angles up to solve for x. So 6x minus 2 equals 4x plus 8. Subtract the 4x, add the 2, and 2x is equal to 10, which means that x is equal to 5. So, use the properties of the different figures, rhombus, rectangle, or square, to help set up your equations to solve for x. So pause the video now, work on parts B through E, and come back and check your answers when you're done. All right, so let's go back and check our answers here. And here we know that it's a rectangle, so diagonals are congruent. Therefore, these two segments are going to be equal to each other. So we set them equal and solve for our variable y. So we get y equals 4. In the next problem, everybody seems to have trouble with this one. Remember, if it's a square, it's got properties of a rhombus, which means the diagonals are perpendicular to one another. So that means it meets at a right angle. And so that means this is a 90-degree angle. So we just take 6x plus 6 equals 90 and solve for x, and we get x is 14. And then the next one, a rectangle. Okay, in a rectangle we know each angle is a right angle. So that means that these two angles are not congruent because they're only congruent in a rhombus or a square. These two angles here are going to add up to 90. They're going to form a right angle, so they add up to 90. So x minus 1 plus 2x plus 10 equals 90. Solve for x, and we get x is 27. And that brings us to our last one. This one here seems to give people a little more problems because they're in two different angles in the rhombus. So we know that these are right angles, they're perpendicular. That also means that these are going to bisect each other. So these four angles are the same, and then these four over here are the same. So what we have here is we have this angle here, 2x plus 8 goes for this angle, but it means it also goes for this angle here. And 4x plus 10 is the same angle through all four of these around here. Which means we have a triangle, right triangle at the top, that has an angle measure of 2x plus 8, it has an angle measure of 90, and a 4x plus 10. So because it's a right triangle, then these two angles right here are also going to equal 90. So we can take and add them up, set them equal to 90, and then solve for x, which gives us 12. So this concludes the lesson 6.5, conditions for rhombuses, rectangles, and squares.